perhaps this is Tamra Samuel, the overall moderator. We might use the time to for me to just share some general housekeeping messages and technical issues for the meeting. So as you see in the program, we will have 7 moderated sessions in the 3 half days. For each moderated session on the virtual podium, as it were, we will have a moderator, there would be a lead presenter or presenters, and there will be panelists or discussants. These will have enabled cameras and microphones on their devices, so you will be able to hear them and to see them. Once the presenters and panelists finish making their interventions, the question and answer in this part begins. First, there will be a few pre-registered participants who will be given the floor by the moderator to pose questions or make a brief comment. These pre-registered participants will have their cameras and their microphones enabled during the interventions. Now, we will request that questions and comments be very concise so that we can have opportunities of others. Now, the other attendees following the ADS from across the world will be able to submit questions via the chat function on the platform for sessions 2 to 7. Session 1 will be the setting the scene session, so there will be no Q&A session for that. So given the high volume of attendees, general attendees will not have their cameras and microphones enabled, and so their comments and questions can be submitted in writing via the chat box only. The moderator will select and read questions received from the general audience via the chat and allow presenters and panelists to respond. As with any forum, there's no guarantee that all comments and questions will be entertained, so the moderator will have to be selective depending on the number of questions he gets. A few general ideas and recommendations. Given the difficulty sometimes with the technology, we would request people to speak clearly and deliberately to overcome some of the distortions and interference and echoes and things like that. And to be in a quiet room would be very helpful. But this is all for people who have their microphones and cameras enabled. For people to mute their devices when they are not speaking to eliminate any kind of background noise. Also, for the pre-registered speakers, when you are given the floor during the Q&A discussion session, turn on the camera and unmute your microphone. So please familiarize yourselves with the buttons. The general audience, the non-registered participants, use the chat box, as we said, and then the moderator will receive those questions. Keep your questions or remarks focused and concise so that others can also get an opportunity. As you can see, our program is quite compact. Session moderators have been asked to strictly enforce the allotted times for presenters, panelists, and for the Q&A from attendees. Respect, obviously, for others' views, even if you do not agree with them, and keeping all interactions cordial and professional is important. Thank you very much. Over to you, USG Gowanus.
Thank you very much. If we have not connected with her, I think what we will do is to rearrange so that after we close the session, she could still be speaking to us. But at this point, I would sincerely like to thank all the speakers this morning and for the insights that they have given us. I know it is trying times for all of us as COVID-19 has hit us really hard. But I just want to reiterate that COVID-19 is just another gun for us to silence. United in solidarity, we will overcome COVID-19. United in solidarity, we will silence the guns. And united in solidarity, we will deliver to the people of Africa. I thank you all very much and have a good night, good morning, and good midday. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Opening session. We session the scene for these 2.5 days of discussions. And now I will hand over, without any further ado, to Ms. Melissa Fleming, UN Under-Secretary General for Global Communication, who will be moderating this session. Over to you, USG Melissa Fleming.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are connected from. My name is Melissa Fleming, as you just introduced me, and I am the UN Undersecretary General for Global Communications, which means I lead communications for the UN, and it really is a pleasure for me to join all of you today. I'm very honored to be moderating this session of the Africa Dialogue series, and which is supposed to set the scene for why we are all here, and that is reviewing the urgent challenges and opportunities of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the important Silencing the Guns in Africa campaign. And before I begin, I'd like to welcome our two speakers, His Excellency Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who is the CEO of the African Union Development Agency, New Partnership for Africa's Development, and Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, as the world faces this unprecedented crisis, it has come into sharp relief how fragile our way of life is. The pandemic's impact goes much broader than our own collective health, although that had a terrible and frightening impact. It's also disrupting our daily lives, and it has heightened existing inequalities. It's causing growing hunger and famine, and it's endangering socioeconomic progress the world over, including in many countries in Africa. Before COVID-19, as the Secretary General highlighted in his policy brief on Africa that was released today, Africa was on a positive trajectory. Its economies were growing, lifting people out of poverty, enabling healthier lives. And against this progress, though, peace still eluded millions on the continent, and 2020 was a year in which we were all going to renew the push to silence the guns in the remaining conflicts. There's an added urgency to do this in light of COVID-19. Where there is no peace, it is much harder to fight the pandemic. And that is why, and that is what prompted the calls by the UN Secretary General and the Africa Union chairperson for ceasefires everywhere to allow for life-saving recovery work to take place. At the same time, the pandemic is making the task of building peace much more complex. In many parts of the world, including in Africa, we have seen an increase in hate speech and in stigmatization, sowing mistrust and rekindling simmering tensions. All over the world, we are facing a so-called infodemic, a phrase coined by Dr. Tedros, of misinformation aimed at creating divisions and jeopardizing the health response to COVID-19. The importance of having credible, trustworthy, and digestible information that people can act upon has never been more critical. The department I lead, we're doing our part, and also UN agencies across the system. We're proud to support UNESCO's effort to work with African creative industries to combat disinformation through its #Don'tGoViral campaign. by crowdsourcing content in languages and images that audiences can relate to. And I think it has already had quite an impact among populations in Africa. Our network of UN information centers and other UN communicators in Africa have also been active in sharing information, including in local languages, on how to protect yourselves and how to prevent yourself from contracting the virus. The Africa section of my department is also amplifying and creating stories about people and experts from across the continent who are responding to COVID-19. And finally, tomorrow, I'm really proud that we're going to be launching a new initiative. It's called the UN Communications Response Initiative to Counter Misinformation, and it's going to be called Verified. Under this Verified campaign, which we see will be rolling out for months, we intend to flood the internet and the airwaves with authoritative science-based information from UN sources to showcase concrete solutions as well, and as well as spreading science-based trustworthy information, and also to help build solidarity within communities and across borders. We're going to more on that soon, and we invite all of you listening today to help us and join in our Verified campaign by sharing verified content. The pandemic may make silencing the guns harder, but this crisis is also, we believe, an opportunity to rebuild better. By telling the stories of acts of kindness and by demonstrating actions that help communities and countries recover, we aim to build hope that we can overcome the COVID-19 crisis and aim to achieve a peaceful, more equal, more just, and more stable global society. I thank you. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, the CEO of the AU Development Agency. Over to you, Mr. Mayaki.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Excellency President Bachelet, Excellencies Ministers, Excellencies USG Gawanas and USG Fleming, Excellencies Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm really honored to be part of this session, and I would like to thank my dear sister, USG Gawanas, for inviting me. Today, my task seems simple, but I'm aware it is not. It is to set the scene on this ravaging pandemic that has brought the earth and life as we know to a dawdling halt. The socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been analyzed by various leading minds with several publications, webinars, and policies drawn out of fully measure its impact. Thus, I am in these few minutes seeking to go beyond known impacts, fully defined, and bring to discussion new areas for consideration. Also, rather than being a forebearer of doom, I seek in analyzing these impacts to propose the opportunities within these challenges to guide further discussions in this dialogue. This is because it is my hope that at the end of these dialogues, we would come up with solutions to all challenges identified in order to support the citizens we serve and are privileged to lead. So the AU, the African Union theme for this year, as well as the theme of this August gathering, is on silencing the guns. As a continent, we have fully felt the effects of cocked guns and riddled bullets, and never again do we seek to go to the past. However, you would agree with me that to silence something, we must know it. What are these guns the COVID-19 pandemic particularly holds to our face, but we need to silence as individuals, as institutions, as member states, and consequently as a continent. So my arguments will be based on the letters of the word guns. And I will start with G, generation gaps and inclusive leadership. That's my point one. Unofficial social constructs group human populations into boomers, millennials, and Generation Zs based on age differences. Within these categorizations, boomers, like myself, are those born during and after the Second World War, long before the age of the internet. Millennials were born in the 80s, at the inception of the ICT and the internet, whilst Generation Zs are regarded as being a very tech-savvy generation in the era of artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution. The pandemic has forced all strata of human populations to rely on digitalization tools for work and education, and has exposed these generation gaps as boomers, who consequently hold most leadership positions on the African continent and grapple with a new way of work. This situation, however, presents an opportunity for inclusive leadership, and to bridge existing gaps and leverage on the knowledge and expertise on all age levels through joint work processes between the younger and older generations. It introduces us the opportunity to involve our younger generations in decision making on the technology. The second letter is U, understanding governance and bridging communication gaps. At the onset of this pandemic, leaders all over the globe were put to test on mitigating the economic and health impacts and setting their populace at ease. Effective communication has been critical, as heightened tensions imply that the least misinformation could cause major disruptions to the peace of a country. Getting the general populace to understand why certain measures were being taken exposed existing communication gaps between governments and their populace, particularly youth with potentially volatile situations. African leaders have adapted quickly in bridging this communication gap with weekly or bi-weekly State of the Nation addresses using social media, a platform young people align with. The confidence of the populace in their leaders to deliver has increased with an understanding of why certain decisions are taken through increased constant communication. And the third letter is N, nurture and the new normal paradigm. Ladies and gentlemen, a new normal paradigm implies a disruption of nurture, a way of doing things. The pandemic has compelled us to recalibrate work processes, our health systems, and livelihoods, while keeping the pandemic in check. As we fully explore in these dialogues what an Africa post-COVID would look like, we all can agree that our way of life and nurture would never be the same. The opportunity in this is to correct mistakes in previous ways of working, our healthcare systems, and general living, and open up as a continent to retooling and reskilling ourselves in advance before another pandemic forces us to. As a people, rather than push for things to go back to what they are, we have an open window to evaluate and push forward in the most workable ways. And the last letter is S, sustainability in the face of a pandemic. Lastly, as an apostle of sustainability, you would agree with me that the pandemic has had impacts on national, regional, and continental development plans, practices, frameworks, strategies. Within the African Union theme of the year 2020, the pandemic has also impacted on initiatives like the implementation of the African Union Lusaka roadmap on practical steps to silence the guns, and on funding for peace-building initiatives. We seek to recover from the spoils of our war on COVID-19 sustainably as a continent by factoring in effective ways of mitigating unforeseen circumstances of this nature into our planning processes. I believe that having these 4 areas fully addressed supports our initiatives to silence all guns on the continent in 2020, whilst mitigating the socio-economic and political impacts of a pandemic on the continent. In conclusion, I seek to remind you that a peaceful and secure Africa is indeed possible. It is in our hands now to plan smart, then act smart to address the current crisis and make sure no crisis of the same nature or different affects our continent and the world at this magnitude in the future. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayaki, for that very clear and important call to action in those areas. And of course, your words about the need for public information really spoke to me as well. We need the public with us through this crisis and in support of it. Thank you again so much. And we'll now hear from Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Over to you, Ms. Bachelet. Michelle.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I really want to thank warmly the organizers of this event, United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, in close collaboration with the AU, UNECA, DPPA, DPO, UNGC, and UN Women for inviting me to address this high-level panel. Allow me to express my appreciation to African countries and the African Union Commission for the leadership they have shown individually and collectively in their response to COVID-19 crisis, and my profound solidarity with Africa in combating his pandemic. Across the globe, COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating poverty and marginalization. And this is particularly challenging time for the African continent, which is already fighting poverty, a pre-existing disease burden, conflict situation, and heavy foreign debt. Therefore, it is important to prioritize measures aimed at ensuring the protection of the rights of people who are experiencing the highest degree of socioeconomic marginalization. The pandemic clearly shows us the importance of building up social protection systems, expanding access to water and sanitation for all, and building up health systems, in some, addressing inequalities. At the same time, I wish to recognize that several African countries, such as Sudan and the Gambia, have already taken positive measures by setting up special funds to support low-income households and small businesses during COVID-19. Others have frozen food prices or provided food assistance to the most vulnerable. In such times, it's important to focus on those who are often in most vulnerable situations, including women, children, migrants, internally displaced person, older person, and person with disabilities. Several African countries have also taken measures to decongest prisons and release low-risk prisoners who are most vulnerable to COVID-19. Just over a week ago, South Africa decided to consider parole for 19,000 low-risk prisoners, focusing on those with underlying health problems, the elderly, and women with infants. It is also clear that the experience of outbreaks of Ebola and post-Ebola investment in a number of African countries has helped preparedness and response capacity. However, in most countries, access to healthcare is severely limited. WHO fears that due to COVID-19, the number of malaria deaths in sub-Saharan Africa might double in 2020. COVID-19 is also negatively affecting vaccination programs and access to health, in particular for pregnant women and persons with HIV/AIDS living in marginalized and remote communities. This means that we need to look beyond COVID-19 and ensure access to health for pregnant women and expand our efforts to combat malaria and other diseases. African governments reacted early, introducing measures aimed at containing COVID-19 while cases were still low. A number of countries declared states of emergency. Curfews and travel restrictions were brought in to protect the population. It is important that any such measures are proportionate to the evaluated risk, necessary, time-bound, and apply in a non-discriminatory way. It's also true that in some countries, security forces have used excessive force. We have recorded a number of killings and some investigations have been opened. Perpetrators must be held accountable. In a few countries, journalists have been arrested for the reporting of the pandemic. Yet this is time when government should open up access to information to all. In fact, governments and businesses can work together to ensure more affordable internet costs, allowing broader access to information, which enhances prevention. The pandemic also has an impact on the organization of elections expected in 22 countries in Africa this year. Some will still take place, like in Burundi, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, while others have been postponed, like in Ethiopia. The complexity of all these overlapping challenges makes it evident that silencing the guns in Africa requires a multi-pronged, multi-sectorial effort that aims to address in a holistic manner the closely interlinked issues of peace, security, development, governance, human rights, and humanitarian response. On the latter, it is encouraging to know that many member states have stepped up to assist countries through the Global Humanitarian Response Plan for COVID-19 in more than 50 priority countries, with nearly half of those 50 being on the African continent. In closing, allow me to make 4 recommendations for our collective work to contain the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, recognizing the potentially devastating impact on Africa. First, I want to call on all member states to support the Secretary General's and His Excellency's Moussa Faki's call for a ceasefire by all warring factions. Second, a direction of spending to key priority areas, including access to water and food, healthcare, employment and social protection for those particularly impacted by the situation and persons in situation of vulnerability is essential. By doing so, governments will go a long way to fulfill the minimum core obligation of the enjoyment of social and economic rights, which they committed to under international human rights law. Third, partners of Africa should assist African nations at this critical time by reassessing modalities and conditions of debt repayment and support efforts directed at mitigating the impact of COVID on their economies and the livelihoods of Africans. Fourth, government should work with the media, civil society, and communities to fight COVID-19 and protect freedom of expression and opinion, access to information, as well as freedom of association online and offline. During this pandemic, it is equally important for government to hold accountable those who violate the human rights of the population. Finally, my office and I are fully committed to work closely with all our partners on the African continent. Just this morning, we have issued a joint statement with the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the socio-economic impact of COVID and the issue of debt. A people-centered approach that combines measures to combat the pandemic and efforts to uphold human rights of the population, including the youth, will go a long way towards building back better. We are in this together, on est ensemble.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, Excellencies, for these important comments. I think you've provided us with a roadmap for ensuring that we have peace, that we have development, humanitarian response, and human rights during this pandemic, and that this does not make things worse. So with that, I would like to thank you. I think if we stop now, we'll remain within the time allotted. So I will thank our panelists and those who tuned in to this session. I hope you'll stay with us. And it's my pleasure now to give the floor back to Assistant Secretary General Tamrat Samuel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have Congresswoman Barbara Lee now available online. Is that confirmed? And we will give her the floor for a brief few minutes. Congresswoman, do you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please, you have the floor. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Finally was able to get in, but just thank you so much, Your Excellencies, for inviting me to speak at this moment where really reflection and actions simultaneously converge in our global history. COVID-19 has, for all of us, really challenged what we consider normal and what our daily lives look like. But as we learn more about the virus, we still have to continue living our lives. We still have to govern our countries. We still have to find food for everyone. We all have to keep working to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and create a more just and equitable world. Each of the speakers before me really have provided us with broad strokes of where the globe and Africa stand in silencing the guns in the midst of this pandemic. There will be more dialogue over the coming days tailored to the sub-themes of 7 different sessions. By the time the Africa Dialogue series ends on Friday, we will all be encouraged and inspired to move forward. Yet the most important tool we need to have in our toolkit is a mindset that does acknowledge the fact that we embrace and understand the fundamental lessons of COVID-19, which is, of course, our interdependence. This is what brought the African Union into being, and it's what we are celebrating on Africa Day this coming Monday. And it's what the United Nations is celebrating in this 75th year anniversary. As we strengthen our existing policies and events and create new ones, let's integrate our common ground into the solutions. This is one of the central demands that the pandemic forces upon us. It requires us to not only act differently towards each other, but it forces our attention on where our systems and our societies are failing, including in my own country. It's not like we didn't know this before, but COVID forces us individually and collectively to confront the fundamental question of how do we value life itself? On a personal level, are you living your best life? In your family, am I taking care of my family in the best way I can? At a community level, what do we need to do to align our collective life values with our actions? And on the national and international level, what can we do to protect each other, even if it is for our own self-interest? Even if it's not for our own self-interest, excuse me. The intense global search for the vaccine is an example of how the solution must be accessible to everyone on the globe. No one is safe unless all are safe. When framed this way, the pandemic forces us to look at the violence and the suffering that we tolerated before this pandemic. Why do we tolerate so many people dying permanently for poverty-related causes? Once again, here in my own country, in the United States, We see African Americans and Latinos dying disproportionately as it relates to COVID-19 and disproportionately in living lives below the poverty line. Why do we tolerate violence within and between nations? In fact, why do we subsidize conflict with bloated military budgets? While we need to silence the guns, we also need to silence the hateful speech that serves as verbal weapons. Unlike the language of diplomacy of the United Nations, such speech and written word can provoke the use of guns in any scenario, ranging from domestic violence to terrorism. It destroys cultures of peace, tolerance, and reconciliation. This is what happens in the United States. And also, it has caused a pandemic within a pandemic as communities of color, including African Americans, continue to face police violence, police brutality, and violence just because of the color of their skin. A young unarmed African American man named Ahmed Arbery was gunned down in broad daylight by a father and son who randomly decided that he did not belong in their neighborhood. This didn't happen during the segregated era of Jim Crow. This was only a few weeks ago in 2020. We know that while it is fear of the other, however that is defined, lack of economic opportunity adds fuel to the fires of racism and prejudice. But COVID-19 has ravaged our economies and is forcing our citizens, businesses, industries, all to face harsh realities about our lives and livelihoods. Cities, states, counties, our institutions, we're having to reprioritize while walking in uncharted territory. So over the next 2 days of the African Dialogue series, I encourage you to ponder this question in each of your sessions. How can Africa, in partnership with her diaspora, especially African Americans, seize this moment of uncertainty to create a new, integrated, prosperous, and peaceful normal? The Sustainable Development Goals, I believe, are our path. How do we unleash the untapped and innovative talents of women and youth across Africa and the diaspora? How do we harness technology and shape it to fit our needs and visions? How do we transform the current reprieve in our climate due to the COVID-19 into a permanent one? How do we address the impact of COVID-19 without abandoning the progress we have made, which I've worked on for many years, including HIV and AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis? This is something we will address at the upcoming virtual International HIV/AIDS Conference taking place from July 6th to the 10th in my district of Oakland, California, and San Francisco, which is, of course, the birthplace of the United Nations. All of these questions will require us to also ask the type of mindset and political will which is required of our leadership. So let's work together to create a better normal for today and the generations to come. I know that we can do it. So as a daughter of Africa, whose ancestors were enslaved and brought to America, I join with you today to say happy Africa Day to all in advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Lee. We're very glad that you were able to join us in the end, precisely because of the really incisive points you made, very insightful, very thought-provoking. We very much appreciate the emphasis you placed on global solidarity, the issue of mindset and political will, which are really critical in some areas for Africa, but for the entire world, and also for the really guiding questions that you raised at the end that will definitely help the discussion in the coming couple of days have that and answers to some of those important questions. Thank you very much. We now proceed to the next session, session 2, on global solidarity and stronger partnerships for Africa's response to COVID-19 and silencing the guns. I will now, without any further ado, give the floor to our session 2 moderator, Her Excellency Ms. Fatima Kiari Mohammed, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations at New York. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Apparently, we've lost we lost Ms. Mohammed. We have to work on this. Sorry.
You are connected. All right, you are there. Okay, you have the floor. Is your microphone open? Yes. Please unmute your microphone, Ambassador. Can you you need to unmute the microphone button on the left, the bottom left side.
Technician is reaching out to the man.
Apologies, everyone, for the delay while we sort out the technical issues with the.
Sarah.
Very good. Okay, Ambassador Fatima, could you speak? Are you? We still can't hear you. Is someone helping the ambassador? Is there your device? Sometimes that creates a problem. Okay. We still can't hear you.
No.
Speak. Tamrat, can you hear me? This is DSG Mohammed.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm just checking we're back on and that we're with you for the moment. I'm not sure how long for, but I can see and hear you.
Okay, very good. We'll sort this out. If not, perhaps. Hello?
I can help.
Okay, perhaps Joanna, you could, while we wait for the technical issues to be sorted out, perhaps you could get us started in the interest of time. I know the DSG has also a tight schedule.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, these things happen. But I will just step in so that we don't waste a lot of time. And I have the pleasure of introducing the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, that needs no introduction. And I know time is of the essence. Deputy Secretary General, the floor is yours. And I really want to appreciate your presence here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, Excellencies, our distinguished participants, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, really very happy to be with you today. Let me just say Happy Africa Day in advance, as well as Ramadan Kareem. But let me begin by expressing my...
This is the time of my fast.
Could everyone who's not speaking silence or mute your microphones, please? I mean, I'm afraid we're not hearing you. Something's going wrong. You're not muted, are you?
Am I okay?
Now you can hear it.
Okay, let me start again. I'd like to express my deep appreciation to my sister and the Special Advisor to the Secretary General, Beans Garnas, for her leadership, her passion, her vision for Africa, which has therefore brought much credit to the UN in the years that she's been with us. But I'd also like to thank the team, because without the team, we would not have had the Africa Dialogue series, nor would we have had the leadership that you gave us on the Africa policy paper that was launched today by the Secretary General. So thank you so much for that support and that leadership. I'm really pleased that we're participating. Again, history's been made because this is the first virtual edition of the Africa Dialogue series, and in particular, this session on global solidarity to discuss the role of the international community in silencing the guns in Africa, particularly in the view of the new challenges that have been posed by COVID-19. I see African Union colleagues, and I'd like to acknowledge, as I see Ibrahim Mayaki, Amir Al-Fadel, and Fatima Kari, of course, will be coming on, but she's with us here in New York. When the Secretary General launched his prevention agenda on taking office, he highlighted the importance of addressing the nexus between peace, human rights, humanitarian assistance, and development, and stressed the need to invest in inclusive, sustainable development to achieve durable peace. In recent years, we've intensified even further our partnership with the African Union and its member states to scale up our attention to prevention. the prevention of conflicts, crises, vulnerabilities at large, and ultimately the prevention of human suffering. At the heart of our efforts lies the recognition that the 2063 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are the best prevention tools that we have at our disposal. The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the relevance and the urgency of delivering on these objectives. The pandemic has also brought back to the fore the complexities in dealing with issues that sit right at the nexus between peacebuilding, development, humanitarian action, and human rights. COVID-19 is not only a threat to our health, but a human crisis of multiple dimensions. And COVID-19 also challenges us in our common goal of silencing the guns in Africa. Let me allude to three reasons that may be this way. First, the pandemic is worsening the socioeconomic conditions of countries that were already struggling with their situation, and it is affecting their vulnerable populations even more. Increased unemployment, shortages of basic foods and goods, famine, collapse of public services are just some of the consequences of the pandemic that undermine the gains made in the implementation of the 2063 Agenda and the 2030. When the General Assembly proclaimed the Decade of Action on the Sustainable Development Goals, it was against the background of a concerning reality. The world wasn't on track to achieve the SDGs. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed the bar now even higher. Second, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to exacerbate existing tensions. Economic shocks and threats to livelihoods are exacerbating the structural causes of conflict. Over 20 elections are expected to take place in Africa in 2020. Conducting elections in the midst of the pandemic-related restrictions or managing their postponement will present serious challenges and could create further tensions. Additionally, disinformation, human rights violations in the application of emergency powers and restrictive measures, and pandemic-related stigmatization compound the risks. Furthermore, peacebuilding and peacekeeping, mediation and managing peace processes have become even more difficult with some of the restrictions that have been put in place to fight the pandemic. The third is 2020 is the year of silencing of the guns in Africa. All our efforts and attention were to be focused on addressing the root cause of active guns. But now, the focus of attention has significantly shifted towards the costly fight against COVID-19. The response to the COVID-19 outbreak must not result in a diversion of vital funds and resources away from silencing the guns. It should not distract us from the urgent need to end violence and conflict and to lift people out of poverty and hunger, which still remain the key goals of African governments, African institutions, and the international community. In other words, silencing the guns and the fight against COVID are not mutually exclusive, but must rather be pursued in tandem. This is a reason why the SG, in one of his first measures after the outbreak, called for a global ceasefire. Global solidarity is now more important than ever before. No single country or region or community can effectively address the challenges posed by the COVID pandemic alone. But what is so obvious has proven to be difficult in practice. Furthermore, global solidarity entails continuing to invest in prevention and conflict resolution. In today's opening remarks, the Secretary-General commended the swift response of the African governments to the COVID pandemic. Allow me to echo him. The African Union and government leaders have stepped up to the occasion and in the face of the crisis have deepened regional coordination and excised solidarity. Thanks to a common vision and the unquestionable resolve, the continent had embarked before the crisis on a path of growth and of structural and digital transformation with Agendas 2030, 2063, providing a clear roadmap for the way forward. The ingredients of these gains must be sustained. The only road to recovery is the road of integration. But Africa cannot do that alone. The continent needs to count on its support and collaboration from its partners. As the Secretary-General said today, the UN will continue to advocate for international action to support the continent, and the UN agencies, country teams, peacekeeping operations, and humanitarian workers, who all have their hands on deck and are on the front lines of this crisis. But as we confront together the complexity of the COVID epidemic, I'm convinced that the crisis also provides us with three clear opportunities. First is a unique opportunity to raise our ambition in our response to COVID and its impact on Africa, and to accelerate progress on the SDGs as envisaged in the Decade of Action. We need to ensure that we build back better for the people of Africa, and we need to be mindful in dealing with the multiple crises created by the pandemic of the enduring interlinkages between peace, security, development, and human rights. For example, as part of the Programme for Preventing Violent Extremism, the UN system in Benin started working with the UN systems of Togo and Burkina Faso to increase the resilience of the population in the cross-border areas. The porosity of the borders in the region is a factor that contributes to illicit trafficking and to the spread of violent groups, and that is now multiplying the risks of a contagion effect between neighbouring countries. By addressing border security issues and preventing the flow of populations, a programme aimed at tackling peace and security issues is now being an effective tool to contribute to fight a health pandemic. UN peacekeeping missions are also taking this approach. In the Central African Republic, MINUSCA has financed COVID-19 information sessions for civil servants and social workers and supplied information materials for distribution amongst the Central African Armed Forces and the general population. And MINUSCA, in using its local radio station to inform the local population about COVID-19 in local languages, is working to dispel rumours and counter misinformation. Second, several countries are declaring a state of emergency to curb the spread of the virus. As High Commissioner Bachelet has said in the previous session, COVID-19 cannot be an excuse to derogate fundamental freedoms and rights, but it is rather a more pressing reason for increasing inclusiveness by focusing our efforts on traditionally marginalised groups and vulnerable populations. The UN's Rise for All initiative is a good example of how we can counter our common fight against COVID-19 to increase awareness about the key role that women play in their societies. Beyond just our narrative of carrying the burden of poverty, of gender-based violence, of exclusion, we are now seeing women taking up leadership roles, filling the vacuum where men have not been able to do so. And third, let us use this time of the crisis to demonstrate the value of multilateralism. As the Secretary-General stated, global challenges require global solutions. At the beginning of the crisis, some countries thought that they could face the crisis on their own, closing borders and isolating themselves. But pandemics do not recognize borders. We saw it with the Ebola crisis, and we are seeing it again now. A strong multilateral system is key to winning this battle and to preventing future ones. We have to leverage existing partnerships and collaborations, including the two joint frameworks between the African Union and the United Nations on peace and security and on sustainable development. The African Union's Lusaka Roadmap and the African Joint Continental Strategy for COVID identify key areas for achieving the goals of silencing the guns and defeating COVID. These provide valuable frameworks for a coordinated response and investments in Africa. This is an opportune moment to mobilize global solidarity to ensure that the implementation of these plans and to transform them into actions that will address the realities that we are faced with in our response now, but also in our recovery tomorrow. Debt restructuring should be at the core of global solidarity. The United Nations is closely working with the governments, the African Union, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and other IFIs to advocate for favourable financial conditions for developing countries, especially Africa. This is not about the category of countries. It has gone beyond that in the COVID pandemic to identifying the vulnerabilities. Many countries that are not poor, that are not low income, are now facing the same vulnerabilities. Exceptional circumstances call for exceptional solidarity, generosity, and coordination. In fighting against COVID-19 and advancing towards silencing all guns in Africa, how we act now will significantly determine the prospect of achieving a stronger, more prosperous and peaceful Africa. Let's build our response to the coronavirus crisis on the strong foundations of Africa's demonstrated determination to advance towards sustainable development. Let's commit to raising the ambition with urgency, fostering participation and identifying solutions under the Decade of Action for delivery of the SDGs and Agenda 2063. Let us act together. Difficult decisions lie ahead of us, but let us turn the crisis into opportunity. As was once often said, let's not waste a good crisis. This is our only real option if we are to deliver on our promises of a better future for the world and to the African continent. Thank you very much, Beans, and to the teams and to our special guests.
Yeah.
Deputy Secretary General. And sorry. We appreciate your leadership in driving the Sustainable Development Agenda globally. But we also appreciate you as the daughter of the African soil. And we are proud of what you have done so far, not only for the continent, but for the world. Pandemics don't recognize borders. You are absolutely right. You are also absolutely right when you are saying that exceptional circumstances call for exceptional solidarity. No country can do this on its own. I thank you very much, DSG. I now have the pleasure to invite my dear sister and colleague from the African Union, Commissioner Amira El Fadil, Commissioner for Social Affairs. And I want to smile and I want to welcome her because that is the position that I occupied for 9 years. But unlike, did not go through an Ebola crisis, and I did not go through the COVID crisis. But what you are doing in providing the leadership is commendable, and I really want to thank you. I don't want to waste a lot of time in really going through the bios of each of the panelists, but you know her. She has been the face of the African Union Commission since January this year, mobilizing international support and international solidarity for Africa. So without much ado, my sister, can I give you the floor? And maybe something I need to mention is that it was not deliberate that we have got an all-women session, but that is how life goes. And it was not deliberate. I just realized now when I'm looking at all of you, but we don't need to find excuses. Please welcome, welcome, Amira.
Thank you very much, Sister Banice. Thank you very much for having me as part of the Africa Dialogue Series panelist. And I would like also to give my greetings to our sister, the UN Deputy Secretary General, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed. And I was listening since the beginning, since the opening actually of this meeting. And we have listened to excellent presentations from the Secretary General and from all the participants in the opening and in the moderators in the second session. Let me start by saying that, yes, Banice, I have not been to the first Ebola, but I have been with my sister Mueti in the second Ebola in DRC, and now we are facing COVID-19. The right beginning for this statement is really to acknowledge the political will and the leadership of our heads of states and governments in Africa. They, from the day one, from the beginning, when this pandemic started to hit Africa, they agreed to act in unity and solidarity. And for me, this is the starting point of everything we are doing right now at the African Union Commission, that there is a leadership, there is a decision from this leadership that they have to act in unity and solidarity as Africa. And they agreed that the leadership for this, it has to come from the African Union Commission, and technically to be led by the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Excellencies, a continental strategy for COVID-19 response was developed, and the task force on coronavirus was launched to coordinate the preparedness and response efforts on the continent. The continental strategy and the task force have been adopted by member states' health ministers during the 22nd February emergency ministerial meeting on COVID-19 held at the AU headquarters. And I would like to mention here that the chairperson of the African Union Commission attended the meeting and addressed the meeting. Also, the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, also participated through VTC and also addressed the meeting. My sister, Dr. Moeti, she came physically to Addis Ababa, and she was part of this very important meeting for the ministers of health. In that meeting, at the time of the meeting, actually on the 22nd of February, Africa has only one case in Egypt. But it's better that we started, and we started early, and that's why we are now managing to do some sort of control. In this strategy, there is 4 key areas that we agreed to work on it and to enhance it while we are implementing this strategy. We agreed on enhancing cooperation, collaboration, communication, and coordination between all African member states and between the African member states and the African Union Commission. Excellencies, under the leadership of Africa CDC and African member states and the global partners, I mentioned WHO because we are working very closely with WHO, but there is many partners. I will mention some of them during my presentation. Under the leadership of Africa CDC and African member states and the global partners like WHO, are part of the African technical working groups. We have 7 technical working groups on surveillance, laboratory, countermeasures, healthcare preparedness, risk communication, and social engagement, supply chain management, special population settings and policies, science standards and regulations, and coordinations and collaborations. Africa CDC facilitates the task force weekly calls that act as a vehicle to transfer the global experiences to Africa and exchange lessons learned. An African anti-COVID-19 fund has been established by the Bureau of the Assembly of the African Union Heads of States and Government. This Board of Trustees convened its 3rd meeting today. They have elected, there is 10 members of the Board of Trustees on the special fund on COVID-19. They elected the chair of the African Exim Bank as the chair of the fund, and they elected former Minister of Health of Egypt as a vice chair to this fund. The fund has 2 main objectives as been set in the TOR for the fund. The first objective is for this fund to support Africa CDC on doing the pool procurement of medical commodities that's needed for African member states. And the projection is already being made by Africa CDC. The second objective for the establishment of the fund is to enable us in the African Union Commission to send responders, experts and volunteers to member states upon request, also to support their technical capacities. Excellencies, when it comes to the support that we are receiving from our partners, and allow me here to give some examples, I'm not going to cover all. The partners are participating in the fund for the implementation of the joint continental strategy for COVID-19 outbreak. And I will give examples like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Welcome, Trust, and Canada. And some of our partners are giving in-kind donations, like they're giving PPEs, testing kits and reagents and face shields. And I will give an example for this is JACMA Foundation donations. They gave to donations through the government of Ethiopia. And the third one was given directly to Africa CDC and to the African Union Commission. Also, some of our partners, they are supporting the provision of management and public health experts. For example, McKinsey, Dalberg Foundation, and I can mention also UK government. These are supporting in this area. Others are supporting, and we are having agreements to facilitate supply chain of essential commodities to Africa. Close collaboration and partnership with UN agencies, including WFP, and I mentioned earlier WHO, in delivering COVID-19 commodities to country level. Agreements with providers to allocate certain amount of commodities to Africa. Africa CDC has been collaborating with more than 50 partners, and there are different stages of some are still under negotiations. Pledges support to Africa CDC were made, or others have already given the support to Africa CDC. And just before this meeting, I've been informed by the director of Africa CDC that the pledges made now exceeded $100 million to Africa CDC. And we are very grateful to all our partners for this support. Partners are either supporting Africa CDC or giving the support to the fund on the anti-COVID-19. So we have established two funds, a fund that to support directly Africa CDC as an institution and to build the capacity of Africa CDC and to make sure that we are within this crisis to finalize the establishment of the 5 regional collaborating centers, because we are still at the beginning. So we are using this crisis as an opportunity to fully establish Africa CDC as a technical body. But at the same time, we are using the other fund, which is the main fund, the anti-COVID-19 fund, for the support that's going to be given from Africa CDC to our member states. Partners categories is as follows. Philanthropic private foundations, I mentioned as an example, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation plus Jack Ma Foundation. Multilateral, and I mentioned here all the UN agencies that are working with us. There is bilateral organizations. I mentioned Wellcome Trust, but I would like to mention here US CDC, China CDC, Europe CDC, all of them, they have partnerships with us. Our African member states themselves, and they are the first to come forward and to put pledges to fill the gaps for the financial resources needed for the response. And I can mention South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and around 9 member states, they gave support to our efforts. There is countries outside Africa, like Australia, Canada, Japan, China, also they are giving donations. Individual donors, Africans, private sector, like private sector personalities, foundations, banks like Bank of America, Commercial Bank of Egypt, Africa 50, and McKinsey. A lot of partners really, they are giving us money. And I would like also to mention the European Union. We are negotiating with the European Union a fund that's coming directly from the European Union and also from some of the European Union member states like Sweden and Germany. New partners and returning partners like Canada and China. Africa CDC is having new partners supporting the strategy, and some partners provide additional support after recognizing the impact of their initial support. This signifies the trust in AU and Africa CDC leadership. Excellencies, I intentionally decided to put my presentation in a way that it shows the appreciation from our side. Although I cannot mention all the names of the partners, I mentioned some, but really I wanted to share with you that partnership is very important for Africa as a continent. Partnership is very important for us to fight COVID-19, and more financial resources are still needed to win the fight against COVID-19. We are still at the beginning as a continent, but the number of the cases are rising every day. We thank God that the death toll is not high in Africa so far, and the recoveries are in large numbers, but still the fight is far from over. So I'm using this opportunity, my sister, please, and all participants, to say that Africa still need more and more financial resources to mitigate the harm of this COVID-19 on the continent. And I'm a very optimistic person. I like always to have hope while I'm working. I think with all the gloomy picture we see when we sit to the news every day, we have hope in Africa. And we have solidarity with our partners. And I would like to end my statement by commending my sister, Dr. Moeti. We are working very closely together. The level of partnership we have on the level of Africa with me and Moeti, and the level of the partnership between our chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Muhammad, with his brother, Dr. Tedros, is really supporting us and helping us in delivering on our responsibilities. Thank you very much, Sister Panis. Thank you very much to all of you here listening. And thank you for having me in this series. And we will be following the outcomes, and definitely it will guide us and it will benefit us in doing our work in a better way. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Commissioner Amira. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
wonderful.
We can hear you, Fatma. Ambassador Fatma, greetings.
Greetings, my sister. I'm glad to be able to finally join you all. Technology is a wonderful thing, but only when it cooperates, and thank God it chose to cooperate with us now. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. And in the interest of time, permit me to stand on existing protocols and very quickly recognize and thank the DSG, Amina Mohammed. I know she's left us now. And of course, my dear sister, Commissioner Amira Al-Fadil, for their contributions. We'll now continue with the panel, but I will be a bit less generous than my dear sister USG Gawanas and kindly remind our panelists that we have until 1 o'clock for this session. And so I'll be giving 5 minutes each to the next distinguished panelists in order for us to be able to have time for Q&A and some interactive dialogue. So without much further ado, I will now introduce the next panelist who will further examine ways of strengthening the solidarity and partnership, including on silencing the guns and in the immediate, medium, and long term. Our next panelist really needs no introduction. She's definitely the best person to speak to us on this. I have the honor to introduce USG Hannah Tete, the head of the UN Office of the African Union. USG, you have the floor.
To the DSG for her opening remarks. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you very much to my USG Gawanas for organizing the Africa Dialogues, and to my colleague panelists, excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Seeing as I have to be careful with the time, I will try as much as possible to be brief, but I just wanted to commend the African Union for the way in which it showed a certain sense of dynamism in being able to respond to the COVID challenge. Now, USG Gawanas, when you were making your opening remarks, you said that it wasn't intentional that the panelists were entirely women, but I dare say that people have recognized that some of the most effective COVID responses have been led by women. And on the continent, we have to give that credit to Commissioner Al-Fadil, because while our heads of state have been very proactive, and under the chairmanship of South Africa and the Bureau of Heads of State, they quickly set up their COVID response. There was engagement with the private sector. There was the establishment of the trust fund. There was cooperation between Africa CDC and the regional offices, and also with WHO, the Africa Region Office. There was also the team at the Social Affairs Department that was actually making sure that what they decided got done. And it was Commissioner Al-Fadil who led that team. And that brings me to this issue of partnerships. The partnership that we have with the African Union, the totality of the UN-AU partnership, both on peace and security and on development, has to be able to manifest itself at times like this. I would like to focus on COVID and peace and security because I think that there's been quite a bit of discussion on the development challenge, the humanitarian challenge, and the need to be able to respond to COVID as a disease. But there's also the need to look at the response to COVID in the areas where we already have peace and security challenges and where we need to be able not to take our eyes off the ball in order to make sure that we don't lose the gains that have already been made. And to that extent, colleagues who are working both in political missions and peacekeeping missions have also been supporting AU member states in this regard. In Somalia, ANSOM is working with the federal government to assist with COVID-19 response planning and activities. UN agencies and partners have also launched the Somalia COVID-19 Country Preparedness and Response Plan to address the direct public health and indirect humanitarian and socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. In South Sudan, UNMISS is actively supporting COVID-19 prevention and preparedness efforts by providing technical and logistical support to enhance national capacity to test and manage cases of infection, expand availability of hospital beds, and train health workers. And this also includes a major nationwide education, information, and awareness campaign on COVID-19 prevention. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, MONUSCO is providing hours of broadcast schooling to 22 million children currently at home. And they're also supporting the efforts to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 in prisons and other places of detention. And there are more efforts that are deployed across the continent. But where we have the challenge is perhaps where we have some of our most significant crises. And one of those crises that I would like to draw attention to is the situation in Libya. We have not been able to fully fund the humanitarian response plan. We are only $4 million into the COVID response plan. And this is one of the countries on the continent where we do not actually have sufficient capacity to be able to deal with the COVID pandemic. And so as we discuss partnership, I would like to draw attention to the places where I think there's much more work to be done. The focus on building partnerships, and especially in the context of the African Union, the partnership between the center and the regional economic communities, and the structures they have in terms of specific organizations dealing with the health challenge and others that don't exactly have the same framework, I think is an important part of the integration agenda going forward. It's important for Africa to be able to use this opportunity to plan. When you don't have a lot of resources, you plan properly so that you can deploy them as best as you can, given the limited space that you have. And I would very much like to encourage our partnership going forward to see how the United Nations can support the African Union with effective operational planning and support member states in the same way, so that for those that do not have the same state capacities to be able to manage an effective response, we are able to provide that backup in a way that ensures that the response is given. And the final point that I would like to make is that, especially as we are focusing on challenges of peace and security, the DSG mentioned in her comments that we're going to have about 20 elections on the continent this year. Well, there are about 18 left. Today we had the election in Burundi. In a month or two's time, we are going to have the upcoming election in Malawi as a result of the Supreme Court ruling. There are other elections that were scheduled on the continent's agenda that are still yet to happen. And from all indications, it appears as if the various political stakeholders are determined in having the majority of those elections. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is that within that context, what do we do in terms of helping to support and helping to, as it were, assist electoral management bodies in their planning so that if they have to conduct an election, it is done in such a way that it does not become another point for an increase or for a spike in COVID infections. How do we engage political actors? Essentially, what do we do on the early warning front to make sure that we address these issues in anticipation of the fact that they will be coming up, and make sure that our responses to the electoral management bodies in these elections is such that they can conduct the elections with the minimum casualties and with the minimum increased infections as a result. There was recently a legislative election in Mali. After that, we saw that a number of our peacekeepers began to have greater numbers of soldiers who were affected by COVID, but it is because they played a role in helping to support the elections. So how do we ensure that we don't find ourselves in that position again? Because otherwise we will find ourselves trying to bring an end to the COVID pandemic, but at the same time not being in a position to manage that effectively. I think that going forward, we still have the opportunity to think through some of these challenges before they actually confront us. And that is the reason why I would hope that as a result of this dialogue, we begin to focus on how we make those partnerships meaningful, how we plan together, how we focus on not just bringing an end to the COVID pandemic, but to continue on dealing with the challenges of silencing the guns, making sure existing peace processes are not neglected, making sure that those places where we have challenges, we focus our attention on that as well as the COVID pandemic, if we really want to see that by the end of this year, we would have made an impact on silencing the guns. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, USG. Always very clear and straight to the point. But thank you particularly for drawing our attention to the areas where more work needs to be done. And indeed, the issues, no doubt, are all-encompassing, and we cannot overemphasize the need for proper planning and for effective management. And you've really underlined the fact that partnerships are key, but effective partnerships and strategic ones are what we need. And with that, I now have the honor to introduce a long-term strategic partner of the African Union, who is being represented today by the Honorable Commissioner for International Partnerships, Ms. Jutta Urpilainen. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Your Excellencies, dear fellow panelists, dear sisters and brothers, greetings from Europe. It is a pleasure to take part in today's event. I have been on many panels in my near 20 years as a politician, but today we are going to have it in virtual format because of the pandemic, and certainly a new way of working for many of us. Despite our physical distance, I am glad that we can put our heads together for this crucial discussion. My first trip as EU Commissioner for International Partnerships outside of Europe was to Africa with the President von der Leyen. And this was back in December, pre-COVID crisis. We witnessed a confident continent brimming with potential. But more than that, we met a truly equal partner, deserving of our most positive engagement. The EU's proposal towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa presented early March does exactly this. It sets in motion a stronger, more ambitious partnership with our neighbor continent. It builds on shared interests and values. It puts women and youth at the heart of the green transition and digital transformation. It promotes sustainable investment and jobs. Just 2 days after we adopted this joint communication, the COVID-19 outbreak became a global pandemic. And though our world has been turned upside down more than ever, the crisis has brought an increased sense of urgency to our Africa agenda. As we navigate the immediate pandemic response, the recovery pace, and our long-term cooperation with Africa, our priorities remain the same. In fact, they are all the more relevant. The first priority is multilateralism. The pandemic is a case in point. Without multilateral fora such as these, we will not tackle global crises. And this is why the EU is providing support to the UN and in particular the WHO. And that is why we support the G20, the IMF and the World Bank to tackle more action on debt relief in view of this devastating pandemic. Second, to deal with the economic downturn, we need sustainable investment and jobs, now more than ever. Collaboration between Africa and Europe will be crucial to transform and diversify African economies. We continue to promote a stronger investment climate and business environment and increased intra-African trade. We focus on better energy access, on the green transition, on digital transformation, and on education and skills. Peace and stability are at the heart of our priorities with Africa. We don't want to see tension and unrest increased by the pandemic, especially in the most vulnerable regions. People affected by conflict, in particular refugees and internally displaced, and more generally women and children, will bear the consequences. So this is the time to strengthen cooperation to end conflict and safeguard governance and human rights. Women need to play a prominent role in preventing and mediating conflict. The trilateral African Union, European Union, and United Nations dialogue on peace and security is essential in this regard. Let me also stress here that our support to African peace efforts is unwavering. And this is why we stand behind African solutions to African problems, like the Silencing the Guns initiative. Finally, the EU, its member states, and European financial institutions, acting as Team Europe, have taken decisive steps in the fight against COVID. 20 billion euros, over a third of which will go to Africa, has been mobilized to address the post-crisis needs of the most vulnerable. This is global solidarity in action. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has forever changed our world. The fallout will be grave and long-lasting. We have to take coordinated and comprehensive action to adapt to our new reality. But our long-term priority of a thriving and common future is resolute. It is only by coming together through multilateralism, partnerships, and international coordination that we will beat the virus and emerge stronger and more united than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and particularly for underlying that last point about multilateralism and why it matters for all of us. Now I have the honor to introduce someone who's literally been on the front lines since this pandemic broke out. You all know her. She also doesn't need any introduction. I have the honor to give the floor now to Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, who is the World Health Organization's Regional Director for Africa. Doctor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to check if you can hear me, if I'm unmuted.
We can.
Okay. First of all, Excellencies, I'm very grateful to my sister Biens, the Special Advisor on Africa of the UNSG, for the invitation to join such a distinguished panel of women. So that in itself is a source of excitement. And I particularly want to thank those leaders who have spoken, and my sister Amira El Fadil, with whom I'm working on a day-to-day basis very closely, together with our colleague who runs the Africa CDC. So thank you for this opportunity to hear WHO's perspective on this extremely important theme. So the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has highlighted the importance of global solidarity. This is where I'd like to start. Because this virus is our common enemy, and while one country is vulnerable, all countries are at risk. But we understand that people living in conditions of conflict and insecurity are the most vulnerable people in the world. And for their sake, this solidarity is even more important. We in WHO have been inspired by the leadership and creativity of African leaders. And I'd like to commend not only the determination, the action, but also the strong African solidarity that has been demonstrated under the leadership of the African Union, both the Commission and its president. We've also seen this very much at the regional level. We have worked with all the regional economic communities, and the political leadership there and the solidarity has been absolutely solid. We know that across the continent, there are 13 or so countries that are affected by conflict and insecurity, where access to services is a primary concern and is a challenge. For example, in the Central African Republic and South Sudan, only 1 in 3 people have access to basic health services. And in humanitarian contexts, we see that women die during childbirth in bigger numbers. Children fall ill from vaccine-preventable diseases because immunization services cannot reach them all. Worse than happens in the already challenged situations of many of our African countries. Armed conflict can destroy health facilities. It can prevent health workers from going to work, and frontline workers can also come under direct attack. We've experienced in the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that when conflict erupts, activities like identifying cases, tracing contacts, providing treatment, and preventing infection, and most importantly, informing people so that they understand their risk, so that they understand the actions that they need to take, must sometimes be suspended. And this means that infections, viruses, and in this case, this COVID-19, can spread undetected in communities. We're very pleased as WHO to build on the Ebola and other disease control experiences and to start off early in helping our member states to be prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic. And here I'd like to thank very much the African Union and the Africa CDC for the partnership. So we have worked to pre-position some of the capacities needed in Africa before the first cases landed. And we are very encouraged by the strong measures taken by African political leaders as soon as they started to see cases at a very high cost, we might say, both to vulnerable populations, vulnerable families, and also to the economies of our countries to stop the pandemic with some of the social distancing and physical distancing measures. As I have said, they have come at a great cost because of the proportion of people in our region who are in the informal economic sector, for example, who could not go about earning their daily bread. And we are very determined to work with the African Union to make sure that this cost gains the dividend of containing the pandemic on the African continent. We are hopeful and we are encouraged by the signs that we see that some of the projections of the evolution of the pandemic in Africa are not occurring. Even if we recognize that there is still a challenge in having enough test kits to detect every case, we do not think that there is huge numbers of African people infected and dying undetected. We've seen countries that have been able to expand testing, like South Africa, like Ghana, show that you can test hugely more numbers of people, but you do not see hugely increased numbers of cases confirmed. So it means we are seeing an impact in slowing down the rate of evolution of the pandemic in African countries. We are very, very determined to work in humanitarian contexts to ensure that those people living under the most difficult circumstances also are protected from the pandemic. And here we'd like to emphasize very much the partnership with the African Union, with the regional economic communities, with the humanitarian community, the civil society groups, the technical agencies, and very importantly, with communities themselves, the people on the ground, the associations of people, the most vulnerable people, refugees, internally displaced people, and migrants, women, girls, and children, to ensure that all of us play our role in containing the spread of the pandemic, in mitigating against the socioeconomic impacts, not only of the infection, but of the measures that are put in place so that we have a chance in the future to continue on the path to development in African countries, including those that are affected by pandemics. So I'd like just to end by emphasizing again this international solidarity starting from the community level, and echo the statement made by the USG Tete on recommendations to do with elections. I'd like to pledge WHO's technical support in advising the governments on how to run elections, taking into account the needs for social distancing. It might have implications for scheduling elections for more days than normally happens, but we believe that with the technical knowledge that we have, and with the courageous steps taken by our governments to try out these social distancing, it is possible to carry them out even in the context of elections. And again, we'd like to echo very much the determination to use health as an agency for peace and to request for peace so that health and other social interventions can be carried out in African countries. Thank you very much for the solidarity and partnership. WHO is committed to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And let me sincerely commend you, your team and your leadership for the partnership and for the commitment. The WHO is our organization, and we must recognize your efforts and your leadership. So thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to go into the Q&A session, and I'm looking at my clock. We have about 15 minutes until the time allocated to us. I currently already have a list of speakers, which I will be giving the floor to one by one. In addition to that, we also have a chat box where you're able to send in your questions for the panelists. Now, before giving the floor to the panelists, I'd like to the speakers, I would like to kindly request that you keep your interventions as short as possible so that we'll be able to accommodate everybody, but also be able to come back to the panelists to respond. And in the meantime, I will try and see if we can gain a few more minutes from the organizers so that we can accommodate everybody. So once again, thank you very much to our panelists. And now we will go to the floor, starting with the first speaker. I have Ambassador Sophie Mooney, the permanent representative of Algeria. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Hello?
Yes, Ambassador, go ahead, please.
Hello? It's okay? Okay, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol reserved. Allow me, first of all, to convey my appreciation to our sister Under Secretary General Bianchi Goawanas for her dynamic and tireless effort to promote the African narrative within the United Nations. Holding the African series dialogue within such a challenging time is a testimony that whenever challenges arise, opportunities for improvement and innovation come along. Thank you also to Mrs. Amina, Deputy Secretary General, and our dynamic panelists for their stimulating presentation and for wonderfully showcasing Africa's women empowerment. To this, one of the perks of the COVID-19, if any, is that in the face of a common enemy that hits humanity anywhere and everywhere, and affects unequivocally people's livelihood, we need to rediscover the true meaning of cooperation and partnership. This goes through mobilizing the full capacity of our national, regional, and international institutions while acknowledging their limits and striving to improve them. To this end, I would like to share a few comments and observations as a contribution to this discussion. A strong partnership between the United Nations and the African Union is essential to effectively seek solutions to Africa's increasingly complex peace, security, and development challenges. It has also led to a more collaborative action that recognizes the comparative advantages of each organization. However, more practical steps could help in further strengthening the AU partnership by, for instance, further promote the partnership at the level of policy-making organs and not only at the level of the respective secretariats of both organizations. Second, ensure division of labor that is reinforced by a real complementarity and an innovative application of the principle of subsidiarity. And third, reinforce Africa's soft power, notably through AU and the REC's capacity building support while assuring a predictable funding and support for the hard power. Only by resolutely taking those steps can we assure that the AU-UN strategic partnership effectively addresses the challenge we face now and could anticipate new developments. And since peace and socio-economic development should be pursued simultaneously, as it is rightly reflected in the African Union Master Roadmap of practical steps to silence the gun in Africa, I would like to ask our esteemed panelists what steps they foresee to raise the partnership on climate change, biodiversity, health, and other development issues to the same level of action and engagement as the one on peace and security, while safeguarding the gains of the 2030 Agenda and Agenda 2063 from COVID-19 corollary effects. I would like briefly to add some comments on Africa's partnership in general. The African Union have developed partnership with several regions and states of the world, as well as with other multilateral organizations that have resulted in some cases in a very strong cooperation in various fields, from peace and security to eradicating poverty, promoting development, and fighting against COVID-19. However, in some stands, these partnerships that are the very fabric of multilateralism seem to lack coherence and fail sometimes to deliver their expected outcomes. To address these discrepancies, we believe that a clear division of labor based on the principles of equality and transparency could minimize competition among partners and enhance cooperation. The Sahel region is an instructive example in this case. Indeed, and although the common attention of the international community to this region is more than welcomed, given the vital importance that the international support in assisting those countries to face various scourges that cannot and should not be the sole burden of national government, there is a competing trend in the conception and creation of those partnerships or initiatives that in the end affect negatively the expected result of the cooperative action on the ground. The same goes for the effort to face the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. We see a proliferation of initiatives, which is in its essence a commendable expression of solidarity, but ought to redirect in a more unified way that is beneficial to all. Regional and multilateral organizations such as the AUCDC, the WHO, FAO, and obviously the UN have to be given the due support to play their role as catalytic of the international and regional action. Let me conclude by reiterating that Algeria strongly believes in the imperatives of collective and concerted action of the African Union with the support of its partners for the realization of peace and sustainable development in Africa. And it is in this spirit that my country has made financial contribution both to the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund and to the UNDP Global COVID Response Fund, but also because we are stronger together and united in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sofiane, for your contributions and your questions. We have a number of questions that are already coming into the chat box, so I'm going to just very quickly read them before I give the floor to the next speakers, a number of PRs who have requested for the floor. The first question is to Dr. Moeti, and the question is, how can African youth get more involved in the fight against COVID-19? Another question that's linked to that is that almost 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25, which means there is a valuable input in this that this population can make. These are the generation that's most connected and most informed. They want to know how organizations, civil society organizations that work in the health sector, work more closely with the WHO and the African Union. Now, while you're mulling over those questions, let me quickly now give the floor to Ambassador Taye Selassie, the permanent representative of Ethiopia, and he will be followed by Ambassador Munaju, the permanent representative of Norway. Ambassadors, I'll kindly urge you to be as brief as possible so that we're able to get as many people to speak today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Fatima, and all the panelists. And also thank you for DSG Amina for your illuminating and very productive speech in many ways. And I would like also to thank USGBNC Guyana for organizing this program. I will come to my questions, but I would like to say that the COVID-19 pandemic continues to exact a heavy human and economic and political toll on Africa, even as some developed countries begin to see a slowdown. Some of our countries on the continent are seeing a steep rise in new infection. It is becoming increasingly clear that the fight against this virus is going to be long. The recovery period is likely to be even longer unless we take a unified and proactive approach. First, we can only hasten this effort to contain the spread of the virus and mitigate the pandemic's socioeconomic impact by acting together, not alone, as many of the panelists has emphasized. In this regard, we need to strengthen global solidarity and international cooperation every step of the way until an effective vaccine or treatment is found. Regrettably, one of my questions focus on that. As we all understand, even in the midst of a global pandemic, politics continues to get in the way of humanity's collective action. As a result, the integrity and reputation of some of our multilateral institutions and their leaders are under constant assault, so to say. In this connection, what the international community, and particularly the African leaders and countries, should take to uphold the sanctity and the significance of the multilateral institutions such as the WHO. And secondly, as my Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed underscores on a number of events, he stated that the world must know that if COVID-19 is not beaten in Africa, it will continue to haunt us all, regardless of geographic location, creed, or wealth. How far this statement has been said time and again by different leaders, how far has this statement has really indeed sunk into the understanding of the world leaders? Is it taken seriously, or is it just simply, is not heeded well? And thirdly, African countries and regional organizations are doing their best to share the burden and meet their responsibility, even help each other. But we can't do it alone. We have heard a lot of encouraging statements and practical measures by a number of countries and as well as international organizations that they are coming together to fight these pandemics. But how much effort should we exert in order to effectively root out and save humanity this pandemic? And I would like also once again to reiterate my government firm support and commitment of for the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire in times of COVID-19, which was also echoed by the EU Commissioner. We believe the world doesn't have the willingness to hear the whizzing, deafening sounds of guns and bullets. The world doesn't have the hankering or desire to listen news of clashes or any saber rattling. It is a time to come together for common good and the survival of humanity. So silencing the gun will allow us to allocate critical resources to the fight against the pandemic. But finally, Ambassador Sophie and myself took the mic right after great leaders, women leaders, which is indeed an honor for two of us. But I want to note that we are here because we are the sons of a woman. We are here. I am my mother. I am my wife and I am my daughter. So I am here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Tai. Beautiful way to end that. I want to just remind us very quickly that we have reached the allocated time, but the organizers are giving us an additional 30 minutes. I still have about a dozen people who are requesting for the floor on my list. So what I'll do is very quickly give the floor to Ambassador Mona Juul of Norway, and then bring it back to the panelists, because I think quite a few questions have been raised before we continue with the other requests. Ambassador Mona, you have the floor. Is Ambassador Mona with us? Can you unmute the PR of Norway, please? Yeah, we can't hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. I think you might be having a similar challenge to what I had. Can you try now? No, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Okay, I will suggest that you disconnect and reconnect. That's what I did, and it worked. And then in the meantime, I will give the floor to somebody else. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. So I will now give the floor to Ambassador Francisco Lopez, the PR of Portugal, if he's with us. Portugal. I can see him, but I can't hear him. Ambassador Lopez, are you there? Okay, we can't hear him either. Ambassador Lopez, are you there? Can you hear us? We can see you. Can you try speaking? No, we can't hear you either. Can't hear you.
Can I just make a short intervention because I need to leave, unfortunately. This is Commissioner Urpilainen.
Please go ahead, Commissioner.
I really apologize, but I have a next event waiting for me. So just a short answer to those questions which was raised for us. So first of all, I would like to say that I think at least in Europe, we have been telling this fact that as long as the COVID-19 virus is alive somewhere, none of us is saved. And I think I fully agree with the permanent representative from Ethiopia that, you know, this is the concern and we need to tell this to our citizens in order to get their support also to our solidarity measures. And this is something we have been doing in Europe. Then the other point is that I'm very happy that the youth was raised in this discussion, because I personally see that the role of the young people, especially in Africa, is crucial. And the youth is one of my personal major priority. And my plan is to engage young people in Africa in order to get their view to this Africa strategy process we are now working on with the African Union. And then thirdly, I would just like to raise that I think to conclude this debate is the fact that we need more international partnerships. And I think, you know, my title is Commissioner for International Partnerships. I can just assure you that the European Union is very willing and very committed to build up a new and strengthen our previous partnerships with the African Union, but also with the other international multilateralism organization. So thank you for this opportunity to participate in this event. I'm looking forward to working all of you also in the future. Unfortunately, I need to continue to the next event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your contributions, your participation, and we look forward to our strategic partnership with you. In the meantime, maybe I will also give the opportunity to the other panelists to very briefly, if they want to comment before we get Ambassador Mona and Ambassador Francisco back. So very briefly. Commissioner Amira, please go ahead.
Yes, Ambassador Fatma, thank you for giving me the floor again. On the question about the youth involvement in this COVID-19, I would like to say that at the African Union Commission and in coordination with HRC department, the Division of Youth, and also in collaboration with our youth envoy, Aya Chepi, we have launched 2 weeks ago the Africa Youth Front on COVID-19. It is a comprehensive initiative on the engagement of the African youth as part of this COVID-19 fight, and engaging them on the continental level, on the regional level, on the national level, going down to the grassroots level. And they have their action plan, which is being developed in collaboration with Africa CDC. It has more than 6 thematic areas. So I think through this African Youth Front on COVID-19, and there is as part of this front, there's too many civil society organizations, youth organizations, as part of this initiative. So I think through this front, we can have the opportunity of engaging the youth for the sake of taking out our messages, for raising more awareness, also for having their role in the mitigation of the socio-economic impact of this COVID-19 on the continent, also having their role in communicating on the level of the communities, and in the area of testing and tracing, we are planning to give them roles, especially in the initiatives we have launched. So I think we have engaged them. We need to support their efforts so that they can play a better and a bigger role in this fight against COVID-19. And the same goes for the women also, and as SG said it in his opening remarks, that women and youth should be at the center of any response that we are going to have for COVID-19. These are only the remarks I wanted to share with you, but the youth are already fully engaged in this fight on the African Union level. Thank you, Fatma. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Commissioner. I see neither, okay, I see Ambassador Lopez is back with us now. Let's try again to see if we can give him the floor. Maybe we'll hear him now.
Yes, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Moderator, dear Fatima. And special thanks also to DSG Amina Mohammed and to the distinguished panelists. Allow me three very quick remarks. The first, to say that the current crisis has been showing us that at 75, the UN remains agile, able to adapt,